Back in the 1950s and 60s, the Philippines was on the rise, recognized as one of the most developed nations in Asia. Even the late Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding leader, saw its potential. In his memoirs, he reflected on the Philippines with admiration, saying there was no reason it couldn't have become one of the most successful countries in ASEAN. His words carry a sense of what could have been, a testament to the potential he saw in the nation, and a reminder of its promising beginnings. But over the years, Lee Kuan Yew's view of the Philippines took a turn. After closely watching its progress, he became critical of several issues, from the US-style political system and rampant corruption to the media's role. As far back as 1992, he cautioned that if the Philippines didn't get its act together, it would risk being left behind by its neighboring countries who were quickly advancing economically. With Vietnam now overtaking the Philippines in GDP per capita for the first time since the 90s, it's a perfect moment to look back. Let's dive into Singapore's early relationship with the Philippines and Lee Kuan Yew's perspective on the country, its leadership, its culture, and the potential he once saw in it.
If I were a Filipino to cheer myself, I would count my blessings and start in a positive frame of mind. The Philippines is immensely better off than Afghanistan, or Lebanon, or Sri Lanka. All these three have been torn apart by strife and war. Now, unlike these countries, the Philippines can pull itself together and get on with the job. And it has a good chance of success because it is part of a region which is set for high growth.
Lee Kuan Yew's first official visit to the Philippines in 1974 was a grand affair. He was warmly welcomed by President Ferdinand Marcos, who invited him to stay at the opulent Malacañang Palace. The two leaders bonded over rounds of golf and shared discussions about the future of ASEAN. By 1976, their countries were strengthening ties with a trade agreement that included a 10% tariff reduction, an early step towards a more integrated Southeast Asia. But things took a darker turn in 1983, when opposition leader Benigno Aquino was assassinated. Marcos's government soon found itself under intense political and financial pressure, with over $25 billion in debt as foreign banks cut off loans. Desperate, the Marcos administration reached out to Singapore, requesting a $300 to $500 million loan. Lee's response was blunt. He doubted they'd ever see that money again. Still, Singaporean banks eventually lent the Philippines $8 billion, despite knowing it could take decades to repay. In one of their final meetings, Lee urged Marcos to step down and let someone more capable take over to stabilize the country. To his surprise, Marcos agreed and called Lee a true friend. But it wasn't until 1986, after public outrage over corruption and accusations of embezzling around $10 billion, that Marcos finally left power. The People Power Revolution forced him and his inner circle to flee to the United States, marking the end of an era.
The democratic system malfunctioned. Fortunately, a miraculous demonstration of people's power in February 1986 saved the country from impending disaster.
Over time, Lee Kuan Yew watched as members of Marcos's family and close allies gradually returned to the Philippines. In his memoirs, he didn't hold back, criticizing Filipino society for welcoming them back so easily, calling it a soft and forgiving culture. He pointed out that only in the Philippines could someone like Ferdinand Marcos, who plundered the country for more than 20 years, still be considered for a national burial. Despite recovering only a tiny portion of the stolen wealth, Marcos's wife and children were allowed not only to return, but to re-enter politics. Not long after, Lee met Marcos's successor, Corazon Aquino, the first female president of the Philippines and widow of the slain opposition leader, Benigno Aquino. Breaking from the usual protocol where newly elected presidents make their first overseas visit to Washington, Aquino chose to visit Indonesia and Singapore instead. This bold move showed her commitment to building stronger regional ties. Lee was hopeful. describing her as a sincere devout Catholic who genuinely wanted to improve her country. Impressed by her dedication, he lobbied the US to launch a foreign aid program, which ultimately led to over $10 billion in pledges from various nations by 1991, all aimed at helping the Philippines get back on track. But the political instability in the Philippines continued to scare off donors and delay projects. With over a dozen coup attempts since Marcos was ousted, Lee Kuan Yew observed a deep lack of unity within Filipino society. He noted that there was something missing, a kind of glue to hold the country together. Lee pointed out the stark inequality across the nation, where the elite, mixed-race mestizos lived in luxury while the poor, mostly ignored peasants, struggled just to get by. In his memoirs, Lee also voiced his concerns over the brain drain happening in the Philippines at the time. He felt something had seriously gone wrong when millions of Filipinos had to leave home to take jobs abroad, often ones that didn't match their qualifications. Filipino professionals, he noted, were every bit as talented as their Singaporean counterparts. In fact, he said, the Filipino architects, artists, and musicians working in Singapore were often even more artistic and creative. When Aquino's term ended, Lee met with Fidel Ramos in 1992. He saw Ramos as more practical and credited him with bringing more stability to the country than his predecessor. That same year, Lee, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to speak at the Philippine Business Conference. Though he was cautious about not offending his hosts, Filipino business leaders and public figures were eager to hear his honest insights, hoping his perspective could shed light on the nation's challenges.
When I received your invitation to speak, I hesitated. You must have known my attitudes from reports over the years.
In his speech, Lee laid out the tough challenges facing the Philippines and offered a few ideas on how to steer the economy back on track. One key issue he pointed out was the Philippines' adoption of the US-style political system, which, in his view, wasn't working in their favor.
One problem which you have is that the Philippines has an American-style constitution, one of the most difficult to operate in the world. There is a complete separation of powers between executive, legislature, and judiciary. The Americans wrote this constitution in 1787 in Philadelphia, and they ratified it in 1789, more than 200 years ago. They wanted a weak executive president. Having suffered at the hands of King George III of England, they wanted the opposite of a strong monarch. But you are a developing country, and developing countries faced with disorder and underdevelopment needs strong, honest executive government. A US-style constitution for the Philippines failed long before Marcos declared martial law. It was readopted in its pristine form in 1987 by President Aquino. The system worked in America because of a superabundance of resources and riches in a vast, underpopulated continent. I do not believe that Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore could have succeeded as they have done if they had to work under such a constitution, where political gridlock on every major issue is a way of government. And you will notice that since the Vietnam War and the Great Society, for some 28 years now, the United States system has not functioned well in the United States.
Lee also highlighted the Philippines' embrace of US-style free speech and press, suggesting that it had only fueled confusion and division among the people.
The Philippines press enjoyed all the freedoms, but they failed the Filipino people. A wildly partisan press helped Filipino politicians to flood the marketplace of ideas with junk and confuse and befuddle the people so that they could not see what their vital interests were in a developing country.
Lee went on to lay out a list of priorities he believed the Philippine government should focus on, beginning with cracking down on crime and corruption.
There must be a cleanup of racketeers in the police, whether for kidnappings or other crimes. The kidnapping of a Japanese executive in the Philippines, which took 6 months to settle, was enough to abort most Japanese investment plans. Kidnappings of local Chinese have increased. 3 victims, 2 university students and 1 businessman have been killed. Other crimes, especially corruption, must be suppressed and punished. It can never be eliminated, not even in Singapore. It is possible to weed out corruption, provided top political leaders set the examples and the pace. An efficient and a strong anti-corruption unit under the President, with powers to investigate any person, however high up, and to carry it to a successful prosecution, will work wonders.
Next, Lee stressed that the government needs to break down the policies that let inefficient oligarchs control the economy.
The second task is to free the economy from controls and monopolies. The nationalist industrialization rhetoric has benefited only a group of inefficient oligarchs, including some heading US-owned firms. The tariff barriers had been a major element of an intricate web of regulations that have shackled the Philippines, shackled its entrepreneurs, and only nurtured the favored few, cartels and monopolies, from banking to telecommunications to shipping. If you stick to your old policies, because vested interests are too strong, too powerful to overturn, then Filipinos will lag further and further behind our ASEAN neighbors. Lift restrictions on trade and investment, dismantle the web of measures which keep out foreign companies and make Philippine companies compete to survive, not thrive at the expense of the ordinary Filipino.
The next challenge is to encourage Filipinos to take politics more seriously, and Lee is urging the press to step up and educate the public.
The Ramos administration can make ordinary Filipinos understand that politics is not simply elections with singing and fiestas and giveaways, but that it is about their lives, their jobs, their wages, their homes, schools for their children, hospitals. Then the situation can change dramatically. The Philippines has a lively and a ambitious press. I think they should undertake this vital job of educating the Filipino voter of the link between political policies, macroeconomic reforms, low inflation, confidence, law and order, with his welfare. And if they take that as their national duty, it can be done.
Finally, Lee highlighted the need for the Philippines to tackle its infrastructure issues, pointing out that regular power outages are a major turnoff for foreign investors.
Third, build up your infrastructure like power stations, roads, communications, either in partnership with or completely through the private sector. There's huge losses suffered by industrial and commercial establishments due to the electricity shortages and scheduled power blackouts, averaging 7 hours a day, with foreign investors closely monitoring the country for a stable political transition. The infrastructure problem is publicity it can ill afford.
Lee wrapped up by stating that the Philippines can rise above these challenges. There's no reason they can't achieve success.
I hope I have provoked you provoked you into setting your priorities for getting your act together so that you can achieve your potential. If you maximize the next 6 years of the Ramos administration, then you will get yourselves back into the mainstream of growth and development and be in the same league as Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. The OECD calls them now the new dynamic economies of Asia. You can be and should be one of them. Thank you.
More than 30 years after Lee's speech, the Philippines has made notable progress in various areas. However, issues like kidnappings, corruption, and frequent power outages still persist in 2024. Interestingly, Lee rarely mentioned the Philippines in his later writings or speeches. While the relationship between the Philippines and Singapore has generally been positive, the treatment of overseas Filipino workers has sometimes caused tension. A major turning point came in 1995 when Flor Contraplacion, a Filipino domestic worker, was executed in Singapore after being convicted of murdering another maid and a 3-year-old boy. This event sparked widespread outrage and protests back in the Philippines, with future President Rodrigo Duterte even calling for a boycott of Singaporean products and urging Filipinos to burn the Singaporean flag in protest. Additionally, during the economic fallout from the SARS crisis in 2003, Lee found himself defending Filipino workers amid growing dissatisfaction among Singaporeans about foreign labor.
And the boys are asking, why are the Filipinos still here when we are losing our jobs?
If we say tomorrow all foreign workers leave, I think Singapore will be worse off. So I'm sorry if I cannot give you a simple answer, yes, let's sack the Filipinos. Can't be done.
Fast forward to today, and the Philippines and Singapore are celebrating a strong partnership, marking 55 years of diplomatic relations. This long-lasting relationship spans various sectors, including economics, technology, education, and defense. Lee recognized the Philippines' incredible potential, especially with its young, English-speaking population. Today, Singapore remains one of the Philippines' largest investors and trade partners, with the ambitious New Clark City development attracting attention from Singaporean companies eager to take advantage of the country's growth. In his memoirs, Lee emphasized that if the Filipino people could hold their leaders accountable, there would be no limits to what they could achieve. Thanks for watching. If you found this insightful, be sure to like and subscribe for more.